Hi, I'm Katie Kahn. In this video, I'm going to show you some of my favorite tools and where to get them. Before I start, you're going to be hearing a lot about this company, Wawak. I'm not endorsed by them in any way, I just really like their selection, and they have great prices and fast shipping. I buy all of my thread and zippers from Wawak, and most of my tools and notions there too. Seriously, check them out and save yourself some money. The markup at sewing stores like Joann's is absurd. So anyway, for all the tools I'm going to go over, let's just assume they're from Wawak unless otherwise stated. Alright, let's start with pattern making tools. These aren't all of my tools, these are just my favorites that I want to share with you. I have this tracing wheel. It's great to transfer markings on pattern paper. Here I'm marking the stitch line through a pleat, and here I'm marking through heavier paper where tracing wouldn't be an option. This is a drill punch. I got mine from Ace Sewing. It comes with an assortment of different size tips, and it's really great for punching holes in patterns to mark darts, pocket placements, anything like that. Otherwise you would use an awl, but that just tears a hole in the pattern paper and it can close up as you're marking it. So the drill punch is a great solution to that. This is a MC Meith brand notcher that's a little pricey. It's about $80, but it's so worth it. You can get cheaper ones, but they are just garbage. The MC Meith notches perfectly every time. It's super reliable, and this one is 12 years old and going strong, so yeah, definitely worth the money. I pretty much avoid scissors as much as possible, so I use whatever is the generic term for an X-Acto knife to cut out all of my patterns. This one is Fiskars, and it has a comfort grip, so it's really nice to use. Pattern weights are nice, but they get expensive and aren't completely necessary. The heavy-duty ones are really sturdy, and these little sandbag ones are nice for smaller pattern pieces. But before this, I actually just used old liquor bottles filled with water. I would even paint them to make them more fun. Now I just have a couple of these cute little skulls. And here are a few of my favorite rulers. This one is surprisingly delicate. I break mine probably about once every year or two. But it has a really nice curve. I like this curve better than the metal hip curve, and I like being able to see through it. This other ruler, I wasn't sure of when I got it, but it has ended up being extremely useful. It's an Olfa 6" by 24", and I mostly use it for cutting binding at 2.5 inches. It already has a 45-degree angle marked on it, so it's easy to line up the true bias. This dotted pattern paper is fairly cheap, easy to see through, easy to fold for doing pleats, tapes together with Scotch tape, easy to see pencil markings on it, so I'm pretty into this paper right now. The grid is really helpful, but it's not 100% accurate or to scale, so don't rely on the numbers for true measurements because they are not that. If you need a more substantial paper, like if you're going to be cutting the same pattern out quite a bit, I like this builder's paper. It's also pretty cheap, but you'll want to use masking tape instead of Scotch tape on it, and pencil marks are harder to see, and it's only 35 inches wide, so it's not ideal for really large pattern pieces. But you can get it at Home Depot, so that's great if you're desperate to have pattern paper right now and you don't live near any kind of a craft store like me. I'm kind of out in the middle of nowhere in the desert. This is a piece of muslin, which is usually what I use to drape patterns and make fit samples. The exception to that would be if I'm going to be working with a knit, then I'll drape and mock up either in the knit or in a cheaper knit with a similar stretch. There are different weights of muslin. I usually go for a happy medium, but generally it's best to work in whatever is the most similar to what your final fabric is going to be. Like if you want to make a chiffon blouse, a medium weight muslin isn't going to be an accurate representation. I just ordered muslin from Fabric Wholesale Direct, and it was about $2.50 a yard for a 60-inch width. And after shipping it ended up about $3.50 a yard. Oh, and one more thing right in front of me, my cutting mat. I love this mat. It's the whole size of my table, which is 5.5 feet by about 7 feet, so it's great if you want a larger cutting surface than what sewing stores are offering, and it's cheaper too. The company selling these is DTG Mart. Okay, moving on, these are my favorite pressing tools. This is a clapper, which you'll see me use quite a bit in my videos. It's great for pressing crisp seams. I use it pretty much every time I press a seam or fold. It really makes a big difference. The clapper that Wawak carries has a rounded edge. Mine has a sharp edge which will leave an indentation in the fabric if I press too hard, so Wawak has a really nice version. This Tailor's point presser is extremely handy if you're pressing any small details or tight areas, any mitered corners or a tie point. It also has a clapper on the bottom, so you could get just this Tailor's point and not even need a separate clapper. These are pretty tricky to find though. The one that Wawak carries is not very good. For some reason the manufacturer made the point stick out really far from the base, which seems like a good idea to give you more access to the point, but as soon as you press on the tip it just topples over, so it's pretty much useless. This one is balanced well, so you can really press on that tip and it's not going to fall over, so I highly recommend this one. It is a Yomacraft and I got it on Amazon. This is just a good old-fashioned ham for pressing curved seams. Darts, princess lines, sleeve caps, anything on a curve, this is what you need. And a sleeve board, so you can insert this into your sleeve or pant leg and press the seams without pressing any unwanted folds. This is just some weird old one that I got at a thrift store. Wawak has a really nice one, which I will upgrade to when I've had enough of this one. And here I have my favorite marking and cutting tools. One ruler I didn't mention earlier is this little 1" by 12". It's probably my most used ruler, and they're surprisingly very hard to find. I had to go to a school supply website called unitednow.com to get them. I've gotten them in the past from a different brand, and it wasn't calibrated, so by the time you got to 12 inches, it was actually about a ½ inch short. So it's a good idea maybe to just check all of your rulers and measuring tools as you get them in general. For all of my cutting, I use a Rotary cutter. I like the Fiskars brand. I think it's more comfortable to hold and use than Olfa cutters. But they're more dangerous to use because the blade comes off just by unscrewing this thing here. And it will unscrew as you use it, and I have had it unscrew as I used it, and the blade popped off and cut my thumb open, so just be careful if you're going to use the Fiskars. Now I check the screw after every cut. Olfa is safer to use because you have to physically pop this thing out to take the blade off, but I just don't care for the feel of them as much. I mostly use a standard 45mm blade, but I like the little 18mm blade for tight curves or other little areas. Then these are my favorite snips. This is a Whisk Quick Snip, and I cannot function without this little guy. I use these instead of a seam ripper. I use them to trim thread, to snip fabric sometimes. They're really super handy. I keep little scissors by my machine to snip away corners or curved seam allowances, or to grade seams. There's a lot of little trimming you have to do while you're sewing, so I keep a sharp little scissor nearby. I happen to get these Ginghers. When you get them, they're so sharp, but they get dull really quickly as you use them, and if you drop them, forget it, they are goners. So I got these diamond sharpeners from Harbor Freight, and now I can touch up my scissors whenever they get dull or nicked from being dropped or accidentally cutting into a pin. This is a water-soluble pencil. It's great for marking polyurethane-coated fabrics like fake leather or even real leather. See how it doesn't really leave a mark, but if you wet the tip, I just dab it on my tongue, you can see it marks more easily now. And then of course, friction pins. I love these so much. I have markers and pins in an assortment of colors. They erase with heat, so you can mark whatever, and then remove the marks with your iron. You can also use just the steam from the iron if the fabric is heat sensitive. I use them now when I'm draping, and then I can reuse the muslin, or if I'm drawing style lines and I don't like them, I can just run the iron over it and start over, even on paper. One word of caution with these though, on some fabrics they will leave like a shadow after it's erased, so always be sure to check them. Some office supply stores like Staples carry the pins, but I have to go to Amazon for the markers. Thimbles! It took me a long time before I started using a thimble because I didn't know that they came in different sizes. I only had some old hand-me-downs that were too big and they would fall off, and I thought, what the hell is the point of this? So, if you get the right size, it should stay on your finger while you're working. And you'll want the kind with an open top so you still have a bit of sensitivity in your finger. This will help protect your finger while hand sewing, and it makes it easier to hand sew through tough fabrics. This is a Choco liner, and I want to like these, I really do, because they leave a nice fine line, but they do leave a lot of powder behind, so they're messy and they're too easy to wipe off. They're okay if you're going to mark and sew immediately, but if you're going to mark and then do some other work on the garment, this is probably going to wear away. Even though I rarely use these, I'm including it in my favorites because sometimes it is exactly what I need. I use it the most to mark dark colored bias strips because otherwise I'd have to stop and sharpen my chalk too often. Which brings me to this Tailor's chalk, which is what I do use the most for marking. I use the clay chalk. It's also available in a wax chalk, which some people like because it irons away, but I have seen it leave a stain behind too many times, so I usually steer clear of the wax chalk and only use the clay chalk. The Tailor's chalk needs to be sharpened a lot, so I use a straight razor to shave the sides back into a point. This needle has a blunt tip and a large eye. You can get these in a pack of upholstery repair needles. I use it to thread my serger tails back through the serged edge to finish the seams. And then my beautifully organized pin cushion. This isn't because I'm neurotic, it's because each of these pins is made of a different gauge of wire and a different length, so they're used for different fabrics. The yellow ones I don't use very often because I find the ball actually hurts my fingers after a while, and it's a thicker gauge so it can feel a little clumsy going through fabrics. They're good for heavy-duty fabrics that would otherwise put too much stress on the smaller gauge pins and bend them. The white pins are the ones I use the most often. They're glass head pins, and the gauge is heavy enough for most fabrics I use, and it has a nice sharp point so it gets through the fabric really easily. The blue head pins are ultra fine, and they're good for satin, chiffon, any very delicate fabric that even the white pins might snag. I even use them on fake leather because they're so small they don't usually leave a hole behind. But they're so sharp, it feels like they go straight to the bone if you ever prick yourself with it, so just be really careful when you're using these, they really hurt. And then there's this other glass head pin that's really long. I just use these for thick fabrics like fur or anything with batting that you would need that length for. Boop. Another tool that I really like is these little binding makers. I tied an example of what they make on each one so I have a size reference, but the size does vary based on the fabric you're using. I like that I can make a clean binding out of practically any fabric I want, and they're fairly easy to use. You just cut a strip of fabric on the bias, insert the edge into the binding maker, use an awl to push it through if you need, and then slowly pull the binding maker along and press close to the edge. Then, fold it not completely in half, you want it ever so slightly staggered up to 1/8 of an inch, and press it again. And there you have your own custom-made binding, and that is a wonderful thing.